you're all here. Judging by the lengthy title of the speech, I'm sure you already have a lot of thoughts in your head. For example, there's a 2 there, and we know that sequels are never as good as the original, but I was out in the hall, I was listening to Maroon 5, I was really trying to get pumped up for this, so I'm going to try to live up to the first speech I did on the topic. So, here we go. What I'd like to begin with is by challenging this notion, and I'm sure you will agree on at least a basic level, that the stories you've heard from transgender people about their lives, and from the stories you will hear from me now, that we are not like everyone else. I will guess that most of you do not face the possibility of violence when using a public restroom, nor do you have to explain your bodies or explain how you ought to be addressed, or worry about employment because your resume has information that seems to conflict with who you are now. Trans people have different cultural expectations, troubles, interests, and even uses of languages. As we see from my speech, a bit of a play on words here, the joys and perils of being a transgender, which right off the bat, I'll give you a little English lesson. That's not the correct way to refer to a transgender person, right? You wouldn't call a African-American person a black, or a gay person a gay, right? Transgendered, also incorrect use of language for the record. So in many ways, it is like we are living in a parallel world. However, that is not unique to trans people. So what I'd like to begin with is by problematizing our neoliberal conception of multiculturalism, which claims inclusion and the tolerance of all, but only in so much as it celebrates its own individualistic image within the cultures of others. I think Quentin Tarantino's Django Unchained, you familiar with this picture? Okay. I think this is a perfect example of this kind of multiculturalism, where he celebrates the American values of capitalism and individualistic black slave who just happens to be so special and unique and fights back against his white slave masters, and even the Uncle Tom house slaves who protect their rule. What is of course wrong with this is it rejects a whole history of slave revolts and camaraderie, and the collective culture which supported them, instead to offer freedom and meaning only in the sense of the individualistic culture, which ironically created the system of and management of their own oppression. 12 Years a Slave is another example of this kind of liberal individualism, where a free man is forced back into slavery and is tough and individualistic enough to endure the conditions of hell, watching other slaves commit suicide and even refusing to help them so he could eventually find a way to return to freedom and his family. Sure, this one is based on a true story, an actual slave's narrative, but why is this story chosen to make a film based on not the numerous collective stories of struggle and revolt throughout our history? Here for the rhetorician, the question is, and should always be, why now? What is the purpose of telling such a story? And as I'm outlining, it is to serve this new kind of multiculturalism in which Athena puts it, such beings remain superfluous in a way, and yet they slyly get interpolated in the all too intelligible categories of the normative human. Or to put it plainly, an exclusionary inclusion in which one now belongs, but is dispossessed from any meaningful democratic relations by language, culture, instead of economic, political, and institutional relations in which they are victimized. This new multiculturalism would have us believe that we live in a world which is post-racial, post-sexist, post-whatever, and now people are just people. We are all the same. We all have the same treatment and opportunities. While this sounds super nice, that we will not be prejudiced or biased against anyone, it ignores the material reality that such a logic where hard work and individualistic merits are all that matters benefits some while injuring others, and it certainly works to obscure the institutional relations of power whose resources are heavily favored towards those groups of people who already have wealth and power, helping them to retain those things, while ironically devaluing them and making the narrative of hard work and individual talent irrelevant by its own kind of nepotism. George Lipsitz's work on whiteness is particularly valid here if you're interested. Thus, with our current logic, reality is often precisely the opposite of itself. If you are familiar with the events of Ferguson, Missouri, or the Jennifer Lawrence stolen photograph scandal, you will agree certain groups of people are certainly subject to different realities troubles, and injury that other groups are perhaps not as subject to. I find it ironic, for instance, that my website, listed below here, facebook.com/rupture.usa, yes, that's a plug, and you should follow it. We beat almost all major news outlets in identifying, for instance, that at the heart of this Jennifer Lawrence naked celebrity photo scandal was the subject position of women. No male photos were stolen. Doesn't this say something about how we are positioned when the issue, instead of victimization, becomes a matter of individualism? Why did she take such photos? Isn't she guilty of this herself because we live in an insecure digital world? Didn't she know they could be stolen? Rather than perhaps we should hold the men responsible for this thievery and the posting of such pictures, which should amount to a sex crime. We see here that the logic of multiculturalism again inverts itself, justifying the victimization of those it seeks to include, and reality becomes its opposite. So what is necessary here? A fight for inclusion of rights and laws. While I don't want to discourage action, the answer is not so simple. Let us take the revision of the Elliott-Larsen bill currently on the table here in the state of Michigan, which would protect LGBT people in the workplace. Conservatives such as House Speaker James Bolger have refused the inclusion of gender orientation in the bill, seeking to divide LGBT peoples, providing gay and lesbian people to protect themselves and continue their support. But they did not. Rightly so, gay, lesbian, and bisexuals joined transgender people to refuse to support this bill, which would offer the recognition of some identities while excluding others. Here's a perfect example of what must be done. We must resist the logic of liberal individualism, which divides and uses inclusion and exclusion to create regimes of intelligibility. Instead, we must take actions which, again, as Athanasiou and Judith Butler proclaim, we must move towards an ontological insurrection where we constantly question the way in which some identities are normalized while others are ostracized or read as unintelligible, serving to justify their victimization. What is necessary is a rethinking of what it means to be human, which questions these logics. To put it most simply, our task is to retain our cultural differences while also attaining and maintaining human rights for all peoples, to create a meaningful freedom and autonomy which respects difference while allowing for the rights and privileges of all. It's an easy solution, I'm sure you'll agree. Okay, so now that this fun, very simple, and uncomplicated stuff is out of the way, I would like to offer some examples from transgender life that might help us with our ontological insurrection here, questioning what it means to be a human. First, I want to use this idea of dispossession from Athanasiou and Butler, which addresses the way in which all of us become subjects in our culture. We, from the beginning, do not decide ourselves. Through language, social interaction, and culture, we are given a name, marked with a gender, and designated a position. We are called into social existence by the other's interpolation in a pre-existing universe of signs and symbols, all without our consent, based on familial, economic, and political genealogies which shape and construct who we are based on our particular bodies given the particular historical circumstance. And we're all dispossessed by this process. Right? You know, think of very few people who probably named themselves or chose their gender in this way, chose what economic background they grew up in. I'm just going to guess that's not the case for most of you. We're all dispossessed by this process. However, some bodies are perhaps more dispossessed than others, or dispossessed in injurious ways institutionally and culturally that others are not. I want to examine this phenomenon specifically in regards to how we use language. Jacques Lacan contends that language is a lot like action, and words can animate, creating a reality. In his Imaginary, Symbolic, and the Real lecture, he contends that language is also an action, and it has a kind of creative power. For once spoken, something new exists which once did not, and perhaps something will become a part of you, something you will carry with you, he says. He says to imagine you give your word to someone. Right? We say that your word is your bond, right? It becomes a thing. This is also true in marriage, right? The words I do literally now constitute an action, a new reality. Now you hold a new subject position, right? Husband or wife based off these words. and perhaps more realistically in this country soon, also husband, wife, and whomever and whomever. Words, social positionality, actions, and power do have a very special relationship, as I hope to evidence here. So I will now share with you my coming out story. I can imagine very few instances in the history of my life that I have not looked as I look now, or moved to look the way I look now. This included long hair and nail polish pre-puberty. In this way, my coming out story is a wonderful example of the power of language, but in a very sardonic way. I should as well mention that I've never used my legal name, or as my homie, legendary Detroit rapper Self-Says puts it, my government name. I always feminized it, or in my teenage years simply changed it altogether. So if I have always been in this bodily position, have acted in the way I act with my body, referred to by my name effeminately, literally all that remains, that was left was to say, please call me female, please say she, rather than using male words. Nothing else has changed. So coming out should have been quite anticlimactic. The world already knew me. There was nothing to change. This step was one I took a few years back now, and here language did serve to animate and form a life of its own, creating something that I would carry with me, as the very word woman created an action. It almost caused the total exodus of all my male friends and made me the immediate subject of disciplining and the fear of job insecurity at my workplace. Again, we are not talking about any material change besides the use of a word. So here, imagine how words do have a material reality. So what does that say? When I looked the same, thought the same, acted the same, for the record, I'm attracted to women, didn't suddenly become attracted to men, if that might be what you're thinking some fear could have been towards the males in my life. So what does this say now, that by simply using the term woman, I would receive such a negative reaction? Well, I think it says a lot about the dispossession of women in our culture. Think about it. When a male wants to insult another male, what does he call them? He calls them a girl, right? A pussy, a bitch, etc. So how does this use of language orient us towards women? What does it say about how we think about them and treat them? It should be distressing that the most injurious thing to say about a man is that he's like a woman. Perhaps this is why so many women today now refuse female pronouns, opting for creating gender-neutral terms, not wanting the baggage that female terms impress upon them. Furthermore, it's interesting to note that post-transition in the life of a woman, a transgender female is likely to see her wages drop by a third of what she once had while living in the social positionality of a male. However, a trans man is likely to see his wages go up. So think about that, right? There is an element here just in terms of male and female regarding transgender people. So this sort of social positionality cuts across LGBT peoples as well, as much of my research is interested in now. I know we have an entire English class here for this presentation, so this would be something I implore you to think about, the ways in which you shape reality with your choice of language. Who is excluded and who is included when you speak and when you write your papers? Who is privileged and who is injured? Who has never thought about it all? When I talk to my English students, I ask them to consider who their audience is. This is something they've never considered, right? They've just written for this imaginary other, right, who's just like them in the same position that they are. Right? What does this kind of thinking and this kind of writing do for people left outside the margins? And of course, this goes for everyone in terms of how we communicate. The next example I will discuss is how trans people signify or recognize themselves. Often you will hear trans people say they are F to M or M to F, meaning female to male or male to female, thus announcing their otherness. Here we see a serious issue in the ethics and politics of recognition. Surely these people would rather be seen as they are by their names, often chosen: Jesse, Zooey, Luke, Emma, Ravi, Bertram, whomever they might be. But their very existence and any privileges and access to medical care, protection under the law, etc., are dependent on a heteronormative intelligibility which only recognizes identity between male and female and the transition between the two. Here, as Gail Salomon puts it, the state has a clear interest in marking these bodies, as gender can be read as a state property, subject to local, state, and national bureaucratic and institutional practices. Think of the intensive regulations for births and deaths in this country. To even be recognized as transgender means to emerge through the Lacanian symbolic order of the letter of the law, a bifurcated male and female historicity to which you are dispossessed. Move to accept your unfreedom to achieve freedom, as Judith Butler puts it, in regards to gaining access to the medical care of transition, protection under the law, etc. Here we might note how language offers potentialities for both injury and for survival, depending on your interpolated position. Right? Now I can gain medical care if I say, yes, I'm transgender, I'm moving from this position to the next. However, those were not and are not comfortable terms for me, though that is, of course, the letter of heteronormative language. So such are the joys and perils of being a linguistic creature. We are shaped and created and exercise our freedom and unfreedom through language. I recently talked to another trans woman, and her introduction included to me that she was a pre-op transsexual woman. This introduction meant she had not yet had surgery on her bottom half. I found this to be a peculiar introduction. Think of everyone, even cisgender, male and female, spoke this way. Hello, my name is Sarah, and I'm uncomfortable with my hair color. I think I will diet soon. Or, yo, my name is Mike, and sometimes I don't think my muscles are big enough. Right? These would be particularly bizarre ways for people to introduce themselves, and yet transgender people do this. So why? So assuming she had just been interpolated by heterosexual standards, I asked her if this wasn't a strange introduction to make. She surprised me. She said, yes, of course it is. However, to be accepted by a world of heteronormative intelligibilities, she had to put everything on the table for them. Otherwise, she could not have access to the care she wanted. She could face scenes of violence if a man was to fall in love with her and then find out her body was not what he expected. So just a few days past the Transgender Day of Remembrance, which happens every year, in which we mourn the loss of trans people who are assassinated simply because they are transgender. And we face this hate crime rate more than the rest of the GLB community. It's important to think about how often this happens to transgender women here and all across the world. Furthermore, the language used to justify these slangs, and there were at least 238 reported just last year, and not only trans women, but trans men, but again, very disproportionately. The language used to justify why these women were murdered, right? She tricked the man and she deserved it, right? It was an act of deception, right? All rationalizations to protect a heterosexual reality, which here is not real at all. It's aimed at covering up the scientific and material reality that these men were attracted to these women, and maybe heterosexuality isn't the stable truth we proclaimed it to be. Here we see the way bodies are perceived can often be the difference between life and death. Perhaps this is why so many transgender people are so focused on being stealth, which means being completely inconspicuous in their new gendered position. Spending a rapper's cash flow on endless surgeries, such as Nina Arsenault, who does performance art to show the unreality of unnatural beauty. She's had more than $200,000 worth of cosmetic surgeries to draw attention to our belief in beauty. But notice that trans people are not the only ones who get corrective surgeries or feel uncomfortable with their bodies. This is why I will and continue to call for the end of language of transition, which legitimizes trans bodies who have had corrective surgeries, leaving those who have not as unrecognizable or unintelligible. One is born transgender, just as one is born male or female, and everyone feels uncomfortable with how they look and will want to change it in some way, right? I do this quite often, but if I asked you to raise your hand if you've never once felt uncomfortable when you looked in the mirror, no one could raise their hand, right? So this is the kind of ontological questioning we ought to do about bodies. And yet we think that this is specific to trans bodies. So I would like to see an end to the whole, she was born a man but is now a woman, or I was born a female but became a male. No. This language objectifies and fetishizes bodies. This only contributes to injurious language which dispossesses transgender people. One is how they identify themselves, and it is their call, no one else's. Gender is so much more than just bodies, as my examples of the power of language has evidence, and it's dire that we position that power to individuals so they may determine themselves as best they can. Here a call for an ontology that recognizes difference and possibilities for all bodies would benefit all of us, challenging liberal logics of male and female. We should appreciate all bodies, and changing one's body should be a personal choice and not a societal norm based on Kim Kardashian or Ryan Gosling, who's good looking, or anyone else. Let us realize that the human body is a spectrum with many colors, shapes, sizes, sexual dispositions, etc., and recognize their equality through respecting and valuing those positions as they are and defined by those individuals who have a right to speak about themselves. Here, I will move to solutions and challenge a major and specious claim that I made in my fame-inducing speech 2 years ago on heteronormative privilege. All right, this is heteronormative privilege too, which you can watch online. Search my name, please. More views are good for me. I advise that one should ask others how they would like to be addressed. This is a claim I made. So not just assume how they should talk to someone, such as, hi, should I use male or female pronouns, thus determining how they would view and interact with others. Well, this sounds terrific. As Slavoj Žižek often puts it in his theory, the answer is precisely the opposite. While offering a neat and easy solution to address those who are different, this kind of logic only furthers and contributes to individualistic intelligibilities, taking the voice and power of one's own representation away from them. And most importantly, people have done this to me, and I really hate it. As of course, it means only asking trans people what their pronouns are, not asking anyone else. So what is the solution? Don't talk. We are concerned too much with ourselves anyway. Listen. Easy solution, right? We need to allow people to speak for themselves before labeling, judging, etc. Sit back, observe others, allow them to speak on their terms in the manner that feels appropriate and comfortable to them. Respect and learn from difference. Do not simply judge them by your categories of identity and by your standards. Realize that they are just your standards. Look around the world. Look through the history of the world and you will see a very different variety of the use of words and of genders and of sexualities, etc. So think about how they think and challenge yourself to learn from this. Let's reject the ridiculous neoliberal mantra that we're all the same and to highlight differences as somehow akin to racism, sexism, etc. That logic is as ridiculous as the multiculturalism in which it protects where we have a Black History Month, a Female History Month, divorced from the rest of our curriculum, in which we learn about the same heroes every year, Martin Luther King Jr., Susan B. Anthony, and Rosa Parks, through an individualistic lens that praises their hard work and ignores the social context, all the hard work of others, and the culture that made their achievements possible. Different identities bring different standpoints, and this is beneficial to our collective epistemologies, and to our collective knowledge and learning processes. Look at things from the different angles of peoples and cultures within our own. This can lead to a brighter, richer, and more intelligent country and democracy, and in fact, I will contend that is the only way that we will ever have a successful culture and democracy. What is required of us here is a kind of self-dispossession, realizing our own vulnerabilities and allowing ourselves to become moved by others. The question here is how to achieve an ethical kind of empathy which would challenge our normative boundaries of exclusion. In Lacanian terms, Slavoj Žižek speaks of the radical act in which one is compelled to action beyond all rationality, shaking those who witness the act to a place of unintelligibility, where they are without words in a space of doubt and thus capable of change. Specifically in terms of dispossession, it would mean an act that challenges our inculcated taxonomies or categorizations in through which we see the world, allowing us to see past these false matrices, male, female, straight, gay, able, disabled, liberal democracy versus fundamentalism, etc., to the intersectionality of our positions, where we are all human, where we are all vulnerable, where we all need others and live in a world of others in which none of us are free on our own. I will go to film, for example, now. First, the cases of Coming Home and Born on the 4th of July. Both are pictures about Vietnam veterans returning from war in states of paralysis. In both cases, the stars, Tom Cruise and Jon Voight, left for war, gung-ho to fight for their country. However, witnessing the horrors of war and the vulnerability of their enemies, women, children, and civilians tortured, raped, and murdered, alongside their own vulnerability, now both being unable to use their legs and functions of their body they once enjoyed, but never questioned. They were moved to become different people. Here we see the intersectionality of subject positions in terms of politics, privilege, gender, and even bodies, as both films have explicit love scenes in which these men must find new ways to express their intimacies. A similar story exists for John Wojciech, who left for Vietnam a heterosexual who considered himself to be a Goldwater Republican, but in witnessing the brutality and failures of war, returned a McCarthy peacenik, in his own words, ready to explore his bisexuality, which he discovered through his close and vulnerable position to his fellow soldiers. Upon return, he was moved to rob a bank for his transgender lover who could not afford the surgery and was severely depressed because of it. Yes, this is the true-to-life plot of Dog Day Afternoon starring Al Pacino. Terrific picture. They don't make them like they used to, by the way. In his case, as well, we see a variety of subject positionalities and proper and improper uses of the body, blurred across lines of ontology through passionate movement towards others. Being open is what we're talking about here. So what is precisely at stake here is our ability to be moved and to move towards others, which of course defies liberal multicultural individualism and may allow for a kind of vulnerable and collective politics of resistance in which we recognize our dispossessions, our vulnerabilities, our shared ontological state, and fight together for our shared humanity.